Okay, good afternoon, pilot teachers, and good afternoon, students. Thank you, sit down. Okay, we are going to actually spend one more lesson on what we have covered on physical or mechanical weathering. And today basically we are going to look at a revision of what we have covered on physical and mechanical weathering. In our next lesson, we will move on to looking at the second example, and that is chemical weathering. So to finish off now the work on physical or mechanical weathering, let's look at what we have covered so far, and we are going to do some revision exercises. Okay, we double check now on what we have covered so far on weathering. From the monitor, you can see that weathering is a process which actually breaks down rocks or disintegrate rocks. And rocks can actually be broken down mechanically, they can be broken down chemically, or they can be broken down biologically. We have only looked at physical or mechanical weathering. Physical or mechanical weathering is caused mainly by stress and or strain exerted on rocks, resulting in their disintegration or breaking up. There are a couple of examples which comes under physical or mechanical weathering. And the examples are: 1, pressure release jointing; 2, thermal expansion, which is also known as heating and cooling, or the process of exfoliation comes in together with that example 2, thermal expansion, heating and cooling. Freezing and thawing is another example of physical or mechanical weathering. Then we have plant and animal action, salt crystallization, and hydration. Number 5 and number 6, salt crystallization and hydration, I mentioned we will cover in grade 12. So we concentrated mainly on the first 4. Let's look at each of the explanations to examples now of physical or mechanical weathering. The 4 that I have mentioned, the first one, pressure release jointing. We found out that deep in the crust of the earth, rocks are actually kept under pressure by the weight of the other rocks above. As the surface rocks are removed, pressure is gradually released and the rocks expand and crack. And this is an example of pressure release jointing. We have made notes on that also from our previous lesson. The second example, heating and cooling. Rocks do not conduct heat very well. We found out that only their surface expand in the heat of the day and contract at night. The surface cracking that results is referred to as exfoliation. We looked at an example of one of those rocks, and that was granite. Also note that the rock of granite has different minerals in it. Some of the minerals which are found in the rock of granite are darker, some are lighter. The darker materials, the darker minerals tend to absorb more heat, resulting in stress being created in the rock itself and the breaking up of the rocks. Okay, all of those then come together with heating and cooling or thermal expansion, or we can say the process of exfoliation, where the surface area or surface layers of rocks get to be peeled off due to heating and cooling. Okay, the third example we looked at was frost shattering or freezing and thawing. Some people would call that also as frost wedging, which is still the same concept. We found out that water expands by about 1/10 of its volume when it freezes. And when the temperature falls below 0 degrees Celsius, ice crystals grow and they exert pressure on the joints. Splitting of the rocks may actually result as a result of the growing of the crystals of ice. That then comes under frost shattering or freezing and thawing. Finally, we looked at plant and animal action, and it was mentioned that where plant and animal actions exerts stress or strain on rocks, resulting in their disintegration or breaking up, then we can say physical or mechanical weathering has taken place. And the 2 examples we looked at was tree root wedging and the burrowing action of animals. So those are the 4 examples of physical or mechanical weathering that we have covered so far. Any queries or questions that you might have with regard to that information under physical or mechanical weathering and the examples of physical and mechanical weathering? Any queries? Questions? Gibest, any questions? No? Okay, if there are no queries or questions, you now have 4 exercises that I would like you to actually work on, and then we'll get you to give the answers. Perhaps I'll give you 10 minutes for the completion of the 4 activities, and then we'll get some answers for those exercises. Okay, very quickly looking at the 4 exercises. The first one would like you to explain the difference between pressure release jointing and thermal expansion. Remember, you were given notes on thermal expansion, pressure release jointing. I do not want you to simply copy the definitions and put it down to answer that question. I'd like you to explain in your own words the difference between pressure release jointing and thermal expansion. That's number 1. Activity 2. What type of weathering would be most likely to take place at the top of the Australian Alps? We need to know where the Australian Alps are and what feature are the Australian Alps. Question number 3. What type of weathering would be most likely to take place in the area around Alice Springs? We've heard about Alice Springs? Which country? In Australia. Okay, if I ask more questions, I might give away the answer. So you're now going to write down what type of weathering would be most likely to take place around that area. Finally, I'd like you, in your own words, to define the term exfoliation. Okay, you have 10 minutes and you have those 4 questions to complete. Perhaps I need to make clarity, especially for question 2 and 3. If you look at question 2 and 3, question 2 says, what type of weathering would be most likely to take place at the top of the Australian Alps? We have already covered physical or mechanical weathering, and we have looked at examples which comes under physical or mechanical weathering. So therefore, I am actually looking at seeing if you can give the type of weathering and the example, if you can give an example of the type of weathering that is likely to take place at the top of the Australian Alps, and similarly, an example of the type of weathering that we have covered already that is likely to take place in the area around Alice Springs. Okay, I think that question was asked because we have only covered physical or mechanical. And besides just physical or mechanical, I'd like you to also put down an example of a type of weathering that is likely to take place in those areas. And this is revision, so that's what we have covered already. Yeah, that's better. So that means this one here, example, is good. Let me check. Yeah, okay, that's it, good. Got your answers done? Okay. The last question, exfoliation to be defined. Okay. Good. Exfoliation is the cracks on rocks which are on the surface and they pull in layers. It means the piling of layers, the peeling of, yeah. This is what? Piling of layers, peeling. Okay. You double check on the definition because for exfoliation, when you're looking at the cracks on rocks which are on the surface, it can be caused by faulting also, so be careful with that first part The second part is more correct. The peeling of layers of rocks as a result of what? Okay, we are going to actually look at the corrections now of those 4 activities. Okay, the rest of you are going to make your corrections, and we'll have a couple of students to give the answers. Marian, we'll start with you. Question number 1. To explain the difference between pressure release jointing and thermal expansion. Marian.
Pressure release jointing is when the top rocks are removed by pressure, when the pressure is released and the rocks expand or crack. And thermal expansion is when the surface of the rocks expand during the day due to heat and contract at night during because of the coldness.
Okay. The second part, where she's given the definition or explanation to thermal expansion, is actually correct. Thermal expansion basically looks at temperature differences. During the day, it gets very hot in some areas. The surface area of certain rocks which are lying exposed get to be expanded. And during the night, it gets cold in those areas, so the surface layers contract. The first part is correct, but the explanation she gave on pressure release jointing, she mentioned that it is to do with pressure of rocks which are lying on the surface being removed. Are we making reference to the surface rocks, or are we making reference to the rocks which are beneath or under the surface? It's mainly making reference to rocks that are under the surface. Those rocks which are under the surface, they are actually under pressure due to the weight of the rocks above them. And when the rocks above them are removed due to erosion, then pressure is released and the rocks under the surface tend to split or crack. That is where pressure release jointing comes in. You double check with your answers for the first part and see if your answer is similar with the correction now that we have made to what Marian has given. Pressure release jointing is releasing of pressure exerted on underlying rocks, resulting in their disintegration, whereas thermal expansion is mainly to do with great differences in temperatures, resulting in rocks put under stress and then disintegrating or breaking. So you double check and you make your corrections for question number 1. Patrick, question 2. Question 2 reads, what type of weathering would be most likely to take place at the top of the Australian Alps? I also included perhaps a further explanation to that question. I wanted you to at least give examples that we have already looked at under physical or mechanical weathering.
Physical weathering.
Okay, physical, he says it's physical and mechanical weathering. And we'll have to be a little bit more specific what type, or give an example of the type of weathering under physical or mechanical weathering that is likely to take place at the top of the Australian Alps.
Freezing and thawing.
Okay, he has mentioned freezing and thawing. Do we agree with him? Okay, if you did agree with him on the answer, which he said physical or mechanical weathering, and I asked for a further example, and he said freezing and thawing, and that's correct. Salesi, would you like to tell us why it is freezing and thawing and not tree root wedging, burrowing actions of animals, pressure release jointing, or exfoliation? Why is it that we have accepted the answer freezing and thawing?
Because the Australian Alps is located in high altitude area.
Okay, very good. We're looking at a high altitude area whereby temperatures would be cooler during perhaps the winter months, resulting then in formation of frost, ice, or snow. And that's when freezing and thawing would be more common. Thank you. Let's move on to question 3. Okay, for question 3, the question reads, what type of weathering would be most likely to take place in the area around Alice Springs? Doreen, your answer.
Physical weathering, and the example is thermal expansion.
Okay, Doreen has said physical or mechanical weathering, correct. The example she's given there is thermal expansion. If you also have heating and cooling, or if you had exfoliation, that will also be correct. Frank, would you like to explain why we have the answer, or we have accepted the answer for that question as thermal expansion, heating and cooling, or exfoliation? Why don't we say that area will be experiencing weathering or freezing and thawing?
In desert areas, temperatures drop during the night and expand during the day, rise during the day.
Okay, so it's temperatures that rises during the day and falls greatly during the night. So the surface layers of rocks expand during the day and contract during the night. Okay, so indirectly, Frank is telling us that Alice Springs is located in a desert area. Okay, desert, semi-arid desert region. So correct. That's the reason why we have thermal expansion or heating and cooling. Okay, finally, question number 4 to define the term exfoliation. Kiran, explain the term exfoliation, or define what is exfoliation.
It is the cracking of the rock surface when the surface expands in the heat of the day and contract at night.
Okay, he's saying the cracking of the surface of the rocks when they expand, when the outer maybe surface areas expand during the day and contract during the night. Do we agree with his definition? Yes, definitely. It's the cracking, and not only the cracking, but also the breaking or the peeling off, yes, of the outer surface of the rocks. During the day, when temperatures are high, expansion takes place on the outer surface, and during the night, when temperatures go very low, the outer surface of the rocks contract, and upon expansion and contraction, the peeling off of the outer layer is referred to as the process of exfoliation. Okay, we double check on the answer for that particular question. Okay, it says there that exfoliation is the process of spalling off a rock layer or simply the peeling of the outer surface of a rock due to heating and cooling. We double check and we make corrections then. Okay, with that information then, that will also bring us to the end of our lesson. And that also brought us to the end of the subtopic on physical or mechanical weathering. And in our next lesson, we are going to actually move on to looking at chemical weathering and the examples similar to what we've done on physical and mechanical weathering, the examples that comes under chemical weathering. Okay, class, if you'd like to stand up now. To the pilot teachers, our keyword for lesson 64 is strain. Good afternoon and thank you, students.